Thinking you've got a year might seem like a long time. You absolutely do not have a long time. My name is James Watson-Hall. I am a field CTO for Zadara. So I cover everything from business value, business outcomes, all the way through to the technical stuff. And I deal with customers of all sizes. The hype around cloud is gone. The challenge I think that we see today and the challenge that customers are seeing is, it was supposed to be affordable, pay for what you use, and flexible. Flexible is absolutely correct, but the affordable piece has gone out the window. People have been shocked with really high bills. And that's partly down to poor strategy, I think, for a lot of organizations. But I think the big challenge today is really around data sovereignty. So, lots of organizations, piled in cloud first. They put their data all over the planet in AWS or Azure or Alibaba or Google. And mega data centers are not prone to failure, right? So there's been some major outages, which has taken enormous amounts of organizations across the world down, including, the likes of the DWP and HMRC. But the data sovereignty piece, I think, is a real poignant one at the moment, is if you have your data, with an American hyperscaler, the Patriots Act in particular enables the US government to basically request access to anyone's data that sits in an American hyperscaler's data center. And, assuming you've got nothing to hide, right? But there's a lot of privacy rules around that. And that's today has scared an awful lot of organizations. And as a result, organizations are, I wouldn't say they're pulling everything out of the public cloud, but they're being much more careful about what they put in the public cloud. And they didn't do that initially, I don't think. I'm not going to blame everyone, but there was a gold rush, and then people are kind of retrospectively now kind of looking back and saying, okay, is that in the right place? What regulations are we potentially opening ourselves up to or not meeting? And then how do we move those back out? And when you hear the word sovereignty, that's really what people are talking about. Or repatriation, which means I'm going to bring it from where it is to somewhere else. Sometimes it's just getting control of the data. And you can see across Europe, France is a good example, the Netherlands are a good example. The entire public sector countries, are creating their own email messaging systems, their own version of Teams, so they can take their data and their email and everything that sits in Office 365 is a good example, the AWS equivalent, and bringing that on-premise in order to control that data, understand where it sits, and put some roles or put some regulations and controls around that data. VMware by Broadcom is an interesting one. It's I don't think I've ever seen an organization ruin, the market share that they had. And I get what they're doing, right? Citrix have done it, VMware's now doing it, or VMware by Broadcom's now doing it. Informatica did it, Salesforce has done it. In VMware by Broadcom's mind, they are 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of their customer base, right? So they want to focus on that, and they want everything else to disappear because they don't want the hassle. It is really kind of that, but when you look at it, you can use any word you like, but it's really basic. And because of that, organizations, MSPs, SMB customers, in fact, it doesn't really matter who you are or where you are, unless you're in that top 20%, you're effectively being booted out. Or you have to go somewhere else and get charged to the earth. And if you're staying with VMware, your price is going to skyrocket. And I mean skyrocket. And I'm going to use an example. One organization that I know, because I spent some time at VMware 6 years ago, signed a 5-year VMware ELA at something like $46 million. Over 5 years, that's something like $100 million a year for the same environment, right? So the other challenge is the drop dead date is like April 2027. So organizations think, I've got a bit of time and I can work out where I'm going to go. You don't have any time because they will literally switch you off. So, for organizations today, if you're an SMB customer and you're kind of running your own infrastructure, whether it's in a co-location site or in a cupboard in the office, which trust me, I've seen before, they need to do something. And actually the option there is to actually go to a trusted MSP. And, like Trust, we are helping Trust remove the reliance completely on VMware because we're our own hypervisor. It's a secure hypervisor proprietary to us. Provides a full service private cloud, so self-service private cloud. So actually, for Trust working with Zadara, not only do we enable the movement from their VMware infrastructure, or indeed a customer that is coming into Trust for a managed service, we provide the mechanism to get here, so we can support any hypervisor into us, and we can do that almost with zero downtime. I wouldn't say no downtime, but very, very little downtime. And if it's an end user coming into Trust, they basically solve two problems. Don't need the infrastructure, don't need to power and cool it, and I get away from VMware. For trust, they can go out to the end user community to say, hey, look, we are free of the VMware handcuffs / slaughterhouse, and you can move your workloads to us safely and almost non-disruptively, and we will manage those for you. So, from a trust perspective, if you're a customer today that is in the situation where you need to remove yourself from VMware, trust is a great place to go. And equally, nothing's ever easy or simple and requires no downtime, but we can make that process very, very simple. We can do it at scale, which is unusual because, you talk about moving 200-300 VMs. We partner with a company that's moved like 100,000 VMs. So the whole process is the platform's ready, it's ready to go, the service is wrapped around it. You get yourself off of VMware, you potentially get yourself off of your own infrastructure and release that CapEx that you were spending, and we do that almost non-destructively for customers. So there's two things really. There's things like the Patriots Act, which I'll cover in a second, and there's things like, everyone thought the public cloud was bulletproof, right? We've proved that wrong in the last year. Major outages in AWS, major outages in Azure. The 2 AWS data centers in the Middle East were bombed by Iran. So nothing is, nothing is invincible. So that's one element is that kind of piece is, actually put your data in the right place with the right service levels, with the right RPOs and RTOs around it is the way to look at it. And the sovereignty one is an interesting one. So some of it is mandated. So in Europe, for example, France and the Netherlands are two very public countries that are actually Switzerland, right? Because Switzerland's an island still. Your data now cannot be outside the country boundaries. And that is legislation, that is fear in some instances, but it's also linked to things like the Cloud Act and the Patriots Act. And probably the easiest one to talk about is the Patriots Act, which is something that I think Mr. Trump brought in his first term is, if your data is in a US company's or in a US hyperscaler, as a good example, so Azure, Google, and AWS, the big three, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are, they can ask one of those hyperscalers to provide access to your data without any legal ramifications. And so that, for a lot of people, is very, very scary. Now, granted, as I said, my first answer is, if you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem? But the challenge actually is the privacy. So GDPR, HIPAA, which is to do with medical images and stuff, those things, are very strictly governed across Europe. So if the Patriots Act is allowed to just run all over that, which technically it can because the law sits in the US and that's where they're headquartered, that is a big worry for a lot of public sector / government across the entire, across all of Europe, including ourselves, right? So it's forced, where there's kind of stampede to public cloud because it's cheaper and it's more elastic, and we know now that's not the case, right? Because people are being slapped with massive bills. Now it's a case of, okay, some workloads probably do work well in the public cloud, provided they are, no privacy rules, no GDPR, stuff like that. And actually that governs an awful lot of stuff. So there's just like a smidgen of stuff that will probably remain in the public cloud, but everything else, countries want in-country, inside their boundaries. And even if you are an American company, here, for example, with sovereignty, you can put your data into trust, and trust can provide the encryption keys, because everything's encrypted on our platform, to the customer. As soon as that happens, the American government has absolutely no say over the data. So sovereignty is, there's definitely some fear in FUD. It's really driven by regulation. And I think adding on top, the issues or the outages that we've seen across the hyperscalers, it's almost like a perfect storm. And so what we're seeing now is organizations go, we rushed to public cloud because it was it was a white knight, not a shining horse. And now actually what they're doing is reviewing, should it be there? Why did we put it there? And actually what rules and regulations govern it? And then making a decision on sensibly where should it sit. For trust, I think even more importantly is the relationship trust has with us and where our kit is deployed in Arc data centers, which is Crown Hosting. I don't think you can have anything other or anything more sovereign than that kind of offering. And I think for organizations that are genuinely concerned because they should be, or concerned because of fear, where best place to put it? In Arc, in a Crown data center on a trust system. I don't think you can get any more sovereign than that, which gives trust a huge advantage and gives their customers or prospects an awful lot of comfort and safety that that's where their data is going to reside. So if you break that down, right, scalable and adaptable, essentially what you're saying is, I want it self-service, which makes it flexible and utility driven. And scalable means two things, right? The infrastructure can scale. So the physical infrastructure can scale so that as the demand grows, yeah, the demand is met by the physical infrastructure. But from an end user's point of view, this is one of the things that AWS did very, very well with something called elastic scale or elastic compute. So from a customer's point of view, you can set elastic scale into your environment. So if you're a retailer, is a good example, right? Christmas, probably Easter, Black Friday, whatever it is, you're going to get an influx of requirements. What you don't want to do is plan for that influx all year round because it costs you a fortune. What you want to do is when that moment is coming, is the system dynamically go, oh, more resource, more resource, more resource, more resource. So from a customer's point of view, they infinitely scale, public cloud hyperscaler benefit. From our perspective, we can infinitely scale the hardware infrastructure, and we can do that dynamically, right? And we can do that disaggregated. So if you need more compute, we add more compute. If you don't need compute and you need storage, we can add storage. If you need both, we can add both. And that's exactly how the hyperscaler works, right? So from a customer's point of view, I don't care what sits underneath it. I just want to be able to boom, 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 more. What Zadara is providing to Trust is the ability to provide that to a customer, that flexibility and that scalability. And what we're providing to Trust is the ability to adapt the hardware infrastructure to cope with those workloads dynamically and on the fly, so to speak. There's a joint first, right? And that is cost and that is sovereignty, right? Sovereignty, as we talked about, right, is driven really by regulation and by fear, and rightly so. And on par with that is cost. Everyone thought if you go to the cloud, it's going to. I don't need my own data center. I don't need this. I don't need to run infrastructure. I don't need IT people. Utter rubbish. You needed IT people to run it, whether it's on-premise or in the public cloud. So that didn't change. You got a really nice deal up front because AWS and Azure, especially, here's some storage tokens, here's some compute tokens. When they run out, your price goes to what they call spot pricing, and you pay for whatever the price is. A bit like the stock market at that moment in time, and your bill gets kind of almost looks like a heart monitor. Could look like a heart monitor. And then you have to pay for every bit of data that goes in and out. And that is, so egress and ingress is where everyone got stung. And so from a cost point of view, you had this nice flat predictable cost, and then you got out of your nice honeymoon period and it started to go all over the place. And then the hyperscalers came back and said, that's okay, we can fix that. We can give you a reserved instance. So if you pay for us this much up front, even though you're using this much, we'll give you a better price. You see, that's CapEx. That's just hidden CapEx, which is exactly what they did on premise. So I think it's taken 10 years maybe to get to this point, but a lot of organizations have kind of gone, hang on a minute, it was probably cheaper or the same price to do it the way we were doing it before. But actually, if we had a defined hybrid model, or we actually knew, if we knew these things back then that we know now, is one of the challenges. And number three, I think, is organizations were hybrid by default, not by design. So, if you think about the offering that Trust has, sovereignty, right? We've talked about this is Arc Data Centers, Crown Hosting, it's in country. I don't think it gets any more sovereign than that, so we answer that question. Customers having probably used public cloud services will take a much bigger, wider view about, okay, should I run it myself? Should I give it to Trust? Where's the best place for this workload to sit? Is it everything there, or is it half and half? So you become hybrid by design and not by default. And then with a MSP like Trust, if you're Amazon, or if you've got your workload in Amazon, right, they don't care who you are, right? They might care if you're HSBC or someone like that. But for most organizations, you are just a bill on a database that gets produced every month or quarterly. So I think for a lot of organizations, if they're looking for hybrid by design, predictable costs, a service wrapper from an organization that actually cares and knows who you are and can guarantee that your data is sovereign by the very nature of where our system is deployed and where Trust puts it, is probably the best thing that organizations can have. And that's kind of the way to think about it, is cost, trust, sovereignty, and probably hybrid by design, not by default, is the way I think customers put the right workload in the right place at the right cost based on the regulations that you're governed by, is an easy way to put it. Everything at the moment is about AI. There's an awful lot of hype around AI. NVIDIA has become the richest company in the world. They're really good at some things, and in my honest opinion, not very good at other things. The kind of race at the moment is build an AI factory, which is all really about inference. So just like really simply, if you're modeling and machine learning and tuning, most people do that in the public cloud, right? Because it's not real. It might be real data, but it's anonymized, and you need the resources to do that. Actually, so we call machine learning for dough and inference. Sorry, machine learning for show and inferencing for dough, right? Inference is where you get your answers. So, from a Zadara perspective, we can have a cloud stack. So we provide trust to cloud stack. Today we have a traditional stack for traditional workloads, virtual machines and containers in virtual machines. So traditional workloads and kind of cloud native workloads, because we have block storage, object storage, and file storage. We can also have the ability to add GPUs into that traditional stack. So if you go to other vendors, I'm not going to name names, but if you go to another vendor, you say, can I have your private cloud solution and can I have your AI solution? Right, there's one stack, there's another stack. They're completely different stacks. They look the same, but they're completely different. We have a single stack of infrastructure that provides general purpose compute, traditional workloads, with storage, our object storage, cloud native type workloads, and with GPU in the same stack, AI type workloads. Are we here to do massive machine learning and modeling? No, we're here for the inference piece. So you might have an organization, law firms is a really good example, right? Because they're probably the earliest adopters of AI that I can think of off the top of my head. They've written thousands of contracts, they have all this data in PDFs. So they will train a model that says, like, here's the requirement, go and look at everything we've done before and everything that any customers have signed, and give me a makeup of what you think I should give to this customer to reduce the amount of time to basically providing that kind of draft legal contract. That bit is the inferencing bit. Once you've trained it, or when you ask the question, it's called a prompt. When you ask the question, it will go out to the trained data it will go out to the data using the model that you've trained, and then provide you an answer, which is called inference. So for customers today that are looking to come to trust with their traditional workloads, at any point in time, Zadara can work with trust to add our GPU nodes, and our GPU nodes are dynamic. So you might have 8 GPUs, and the customer might spin up a workload, use those GPUs, if I know, like 4 hours, and drop those GPUs when they're finished with them so that another customer can take them. So we are enabling dynamic use of GPUs across the stack. But most importantly, which I haven't mentioned today or so far, is we provide full multi-tenancy. So you can have, it's a really easy example, on one shared platform with general compute for general workloads, cloud native workloads and AI workloads, if we've got GPUs in there, you can have Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Asda, Lidl, Aldi. Got to put those two together because they're brothers and they hate each other. But they could be on the same platform and they will never, ever know that they are sharing that platform with their major competitors. So from a customer's point of view, if they're coming to talk to trust about all of their workloads, some of their workloads, or a proportion of workloads that are AI-driven, containerized-driven, or VM-driven, safe in the knowledge that it doesn't really matter who else is on the platform. No one can see anyone. As long as the physical resources are there to support everyone on the platform, that's all they need to worry about, and that's our job. And that's what we do for trust is, you need more resources, it could be capacity, it could be performance, it could be more GPUs. That gives the economies of scale for trust to say, hey, look, we can share this platform securely and safely with 5 organizations in the same market segment without any concern at all. And the easiest way to liken this is when AWS really launched, because they were web services originally, right? Then they just launched like 500 services in like 10 years. But the reason they were so successful is because they could guarantee a customer, you will never see anyone else on that platform. Our multi-tenancy is exactly the same as theirs. So from a customer's point of view, how do I know I'm going to be safe and someone's not going to see my data? 100% bulletproof. That enables us to take that much of infrastructure, share it between this amount of customers. Economies of scale means the customer pays less because they're sharing. And then we at the back end, Zadara, are constantly monitoring with trust. Okay, we need some more compute, put some more compute in, we need some more capacity. The benefit is the customer, or in fact, the customer gets all of the benefit with the safe knowledge that they are not going to be at risk of anyone else seeing what they're doing, what their data's doing, and what their applications are doing. I think today it's the market's tough, right? There's an awful lot of hype and noise around AI. I mean, and this is the key thing, right? Is organisations have budget as long as it says AI on it, which is utterly mental in my world. The biggest challenge today is customers, if they are on, well, let's be honest, 91% of the world, right, runs VMware. Thinking you've got a year might seem like a long time. You absolutely do not have a long time. And there's a couple of reasons why. No one's ever going to be VMware, right? We have a proprietary hypervisor. It's really bloody good. But VMware is VMware. They've been doing it market share-wise 80 to 90% for the last, 20 years. So there's a couple of things is, who can I go to? I've got to transfer all of my skills. Do I want to go and then, find another hypervisor, put it on premise and potentially be in the same spot? Because someone will always take over from VMware, right? There's always someone waiting in the wings. I'm not going to mention names because, it's not right to. So the option for customers is, actually, why do I want that hassle? I could just go to Trust. I can migrate independently from any hypervisor into the Trust cloud. I can do that almost non-disruptively. Like, we'll literally turn the VM off, turn it back on in the new location. I don't have to provide any data centers, facilities. I don't have to do any CapEx stuff. I can scale elastically or physically on the platform. I can benefit from the economies of scale because it's a shared platform, and I get my sovereignty. Organizations should be thinking about that and thinking 12 months seems like a long time. It really is not a long time at all to get that done. So don't sit around and think, I've got some time. Get started now looking at your VMware alternative. And that's either something on premise or that's moving to an MSP that has moved away from VMware, and lots of them have already done it and are already doing it today.